Hey y'all, welcome back to your girls channel. I've been MIA for just a little bit because I was in LA for a teachers conference. You can tell with the skin. Tan, okay girl. So I was in LA for a teachers conference and then I got back and then I came down with a pretty tough cold. So you might tell that there's a little bit of red underneath the nose. You might tell a little bit of a nasally voice, but your girl's back coming to you today with a new video about OCD treatment. Before we get started, I would love if you would go ahead and like this video, subscribe to my channel, show your girl some love. I want to talk to you about OCD treatment because there is a way to break the cycle of OCD. In my last video, I talked about the OCD cycle. It starts with obsessions. Have this thought in your brain, you can't get it out of your brain, and then you have to do something in order to relieve the anxiety. Go ahead and check out my last video if you want to learn more about the OCD cycle and how I actually got my OCD diagnosis. The treatment for OCD helps you to break this cycle. I will tell you from experience from going through OCD therapy that OCD treatment is hard, but living with untreated OCD is so much harder. So OCD treatment is actually called exposure and response prevention. This is the gold standard for OCD treatment. You might see other therapists doing talk therapy or digging into roots, but like I said in my last video, this doesn't help. The only results I've actually seen really work in my life is going through the program of exposure and response prevention. So there are two parts with exposure and response prevention. Exposures, which is the first part, which I'm going to relate eventually to practice. The second part is response prevention, which is kind of like game time. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So the first part of ERP is exposures. Exposures, I like to think of as the practice. The lifting weights, the, putting up 3-point shots, the shooting in hockey, all the things that you're practicing before the actual game hits. So what you do with your exposures is you work with a trained professional. Don't try to do this on your own, especially if you have not gone through this program before. You have to do it with a trained professional first so that your exposures are not too tough. You want to make them manageable so that you actually are doing them, but you don't want to make them too easy where they don't work anymore. What you do with exposures is you actually expose yourself to your fears. So a person with an OCD brain has these obsessions. They're rooted in fear. So what you do with your therapist is you list out all of your fears on a scale. So you start with the least, you go to your most feared thought. Then you work with your therapist to actually expose yourself in different ways. So some of the things that I learned in therapy are you could create a worst case scenario by script. So what you're doing is, let's say you have a thought about, I talked about this in my last video, bed bugs. Okay, I'm really afraid that I have bed bugs. So what you might do is you might come up with a script of, okay, I have bed bugs, this is what happens, and then you listen to it on repeat for about 10 to 15 minutes a day. There are so many different ways to do exposures, but the exposures are practice. You might look at a picture for 10 minutes a day. You might listen to a video for 10 minutes a day. But these are the things that bring you into the anxiety in a controlled manner. But what exposures do is, for so long, in my experience with an OCD brain, you run away from the thought. And what you do in exposures is you run directly to the thought. And this is terrifying for somebody who struggles with obsessions and compulsions. However, when you actually expose yourself to the worst case scenario, these things don't necessarily scare you anymore. So they're not on your brain 24/7. The whole goal with exposures is to practice. Practice putting yourself into uncomfortable positions. Practice putting yourself into the anxiety, sitting with the anxiety, doing nothing about it. That's the thing with the exposures. You're not doing any of your compulsions. You are sitting with your therapist in the anxiety, not doing the compulsions, so you're cutting off this cycle of OCD. You can easily relate this to any type of practice a professional athlete has to do before they perform. So let's take Steph Curry, for example. He probably spends hours and hours a day practicing those shots, practicing those moves, all the things he does in games, he doesn't just do them in the moment. He practices them to build that muscle memory, to build that strength, so that when those instances come up in games, he knows what to do. He puts the hard work in every single day so that when something comes up in a game, he's ready to handle it. He knows what to do. The second part of the OCD treatment is the response prevention. The response prevention is the game time, real time, how you deal with your triggers in real life. This is where the hardest work is, because it's no longer in a controlled setting like the exposures were. Just because you're going through OCD therapy, you're doing your exposures, does not mean you will not get triggered in real life. What the response prevention part of the therapy does is it helps you live alongside your thoughts and push past your thoughts to live your life like you normally would, while taking the thoughts with you, while not allowing them to slow you down in any way. So when you're triggered in real life, the response prevention part of the therapy teaches us to do a couple things with our thoughts. Number one, I learned to name the thought for what it was. It's really hard to do this right away, but when you're able to name a thought as OCD and live alongside it and say, OCD, you're coming with me today, regardless of whether I feel like taking you along or not, you're coming with me and we're doing what we're normally gonna do or we had normally planned for the day. Another thing I've learned in response prevention is when I am triggered by a thought during my everyday life is I might agree with the thought. OCD doesn't want you to do that because for so long, your brain is used to pushing the thought away, trying to get these thoughts out of your brain. But the second you say, okay, I agree with you, whatever, then the OCD finally doesn't have power anymore. Another thing I learned in my response prevention part of therapy was to say to the thought, yeah, that thought might be the case and might not. I'll act as if it's not true, but I'll never know for sure. This helps you live with the mindset of, quite honestly, we can never actually be sure of anything in our lives. And so to live with uncertainty is okay. And somebody with an OCD brain struggles with this because it's hard for us to not have 100% certainty on something. I like to relate response prevention to game time. Because let's take Steph Curry, for example. With exposures, he is practicing all of the things he's learned. Okay, so he's practicing his jump shot, he's practicing his three-point shot, he's practicing his moves, whatever. That's the same thing with exposures. You're practicing putting yourself in uncomfortable situations so that when you get to a real life situation where something is uncomfortable, something brings you anxiety, you don't have to compulse. So as Steph Curry, he uses his skills and his tools he's learned in practice in a game. Well, that's the same thing with exposures and then response prevention. Exposures are the tools, the skills, and you kind of train your brain, train your mind to know what to do so that when you're in an uncomfortable situation in real life, you're able to not compulse, which breaks the cycle of OCD. So that in a nutshell is what OCD treatment was for me. I still do this on a daily basis. I do my exposures every day, or I try to. I do my exposures every day for 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'm ready in real life to accept uncertainty, to use those tools and those skills to not compulse in real life. If you're looking for more information about this type of therapy, NoCD is an amazing resource. I will link their YouTube page for more videos on exposure and response prevention and also all things OCD. And you can also go to their website and access specific exposure and response prevention therapy. Thanks for coming along with your girl to learn a little bit more about OCD treatment, and I will see you next time.